Hello, dear viewers. Hello, dear subscribers and future subscribers. There are so many questions, so many comments. The Armenian people, the Armenian nation, whether they speak Armenian, English, French, or Russian, are, at this very moment, disoriented and truly unable to provide answers to questions that are right there on the surface, right now. That's what I want to talk about today. I am not going to criticize anyone. I am not a judge, and I am not going to accuse anyone. I will present the facts. I will present the opinions of foreign military analysts. I will present the information that can be shared from the perspective of leading intelligence communities regarding the events that took place in 2020 with Armenia and Artsakh. I have done this repeatedly. I was the first among ethnic Armenians who, right in the first days of the war, appeared on the biggest program on Ukrainian television, on Savik Shuster's show, and openly stated that everything happening was a special operation by Russia together with Turkey. I was the first and only one to say this clearly. At a time when no one was thinking about it, no one understood it. I stated this clearly and precisely, because I knew about it in advance. Moreover, a similar special operation was planned back in 2018. But it did not take place for a number of reasons. It was eventually implemented in the 20th. Russia was preparing a logistical corridor for itself and securing the loyalty of Turkey and Azerbaijan ahead of the invasion of Ukraine. Russia successfully executed the operation. The defeat and destruction of Artsakh. The Armenians suffered a devastating defeat. And now, dear friends, I will tell you how this happened. Look, here's where we need to start. We could delve into events from 100 or even 200 years ago, because Russia has in fact used Armenians, carried out operations against Armenians, and Armenians have paid for this with enormous heavy bloodshed ever since Russia arrived in the Armenian highlands, in the South Caucasus. But I will specifically focus on the period that began on October 27th, 1999, in particular. We will start with October 27, 1999, the shooting in the Armenian parliament. In the international East press, diplomatic documents, journalistic investigations, including WikiLeaks, leaks, for example, and testimonies from figures such as Alexander Litvinenko, there have been clear suggestions and direct accusations against the Russian special services regarding Russia's direct involvement in organizing the operation to shoot up the Armenian parliament on October 27th, 1999. The murder of Armenia's top leadership, which took place, and the installation of their own proxies and agents in power, which was also carried out. So what are the key points being discussed in the international arena, including in international investigations, and what is known to leading intelligence communities? These key points are quite well known around the world, but they are officially ignored in Armenia, which is understandable since Armenia continues to maintain a severe dependence on Russia, Example. Alexander Litvinenko openly stated before his death that the shooting in the Armenian parliament was a special operation by the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, aimed at eliminating the independent political course of Karen Demirchan and Vazgen Sargsyan. Russia succeeded in doing this. Next, WikiLeaks materials directly mention that Western diplomats see a Russian connection in organizing the terrorist attack, pointing out, among other things, the coincidence of direct benefits and Moscow's strategic interests. 1999. Almost all participants in the events either died or were eliminated politically. And Russian influence in Armenia increased sharply after 1999, both in the military and in the energy sector. To this day, not a single Easties independent international investigation has been initiated in Armenia. This has never happened. And all this is despite the questionable judicial process of investigating these events and the highly contradictory testimonies. Next, within Armenia itself, public discussion of this version is taboo. The media are afraid. Political analysts remain silent and textbooks skirt around this topic in vague terms. So what was the parliamentary shooting organized by Russia for Armenia? The shooting in parliament on October 27, 1999 became the breaking point, the collapse of Armenian sovereignty, and the beginning of deep dependence on Russia. Yes, of course, it is surprising that in Armenia itself, this is either not discussed or people prefer not to know about it. Globally, most Armenians are unaware of this. How else can you explain the thousands of Armenians who are now fighting for Russia in its barbaric, aggressive war against Ukraine? We have not yet reached the point of the controlled operation to surrender Artsakh. Of course, Armenians are uninformed. Let's move on. So what does it mean that in Armenia this is not discussed or people prefer not to know about it? It's very simple. This silence, dear friends, is the result of both fear and dependence and, of course, of deliberate informational and political suppression. This is the reality. This is what is actually happening. The phrase managed defeat. In relation to Armenia, Isuko in the 2020 war is not often voiced directly by Western officials for diplomatic reasons. But a number of influential analysts, intelligence officers, and independent Western experts have stated, directly or indirectly, that Armenia was betrayed, with the direct involvement of both external and internal actors. Let's take a look at the statements of key Western sources, open ones. I am deliberately not going to provide you with any information from private conversations that I have had around the world with leading figures who possess complete information about everything and everyone in the fields of diplomacy, intelligence communities, and military affairs. I will not present that data, that information. I will give you information from open sources. How Armenia was handed over, and what many key Western sources and figures are saying about it directly. Who spoke within this logic? What did Paul Goebel say? He is a former employee of the United States Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Department of State, an expert well known for his work on the post-Soviet space. So here is a quote from 2020. Armenia's defeat seemed too swift and organized. It looks more like a planned surrender than a military defeat, and Russia, rather than staying on the sidelines, was more likely managing the conflict toward the outcome it wanted. You see, this is a quote. Today, as a matter of principle, I will not present any of my own opinions. What does Michael Rubin say? A representative of the American Enterprise Institute. He is a former Pentagon advisor and a specialist on the Middle East and the Caucasus. Here is his comment from 2021. Moscow was not so much preventing Armenia's defeat as it was controlling its pace, controlling the pace of Armenia's defeat in order to use it as a tool to strengthen its control over Yerevan. This is a classic example of a managed crisis, said Michael Rubin. Let's move on. What does WikiLeaks, the diplomatic cable leaks, say about this? All early leaks indicated that Russia viewed the Armenian Karabakh asset as leverage over Yerevan and could let the situation go if Armenia drifted toward the west. There you have it. Russia sold out Armenia, sold out Artsakh for a logistical corridor in order to start the war, dear friends, in Ukraine. You see? As always, selling out the Armenians. A big hello to the Armenians, citizens of Russia, who are fighting by the thousands for this country, an accomplice in genocide. A country that did everything it could to destroy the Armenian ethnic presence in the Armenian highlands. If I were to take this slice, I would have to talk for hours and days with great detail. Let's move on, dear friends. What does Lawrence Broers say? An analyst at Chatham House, a specialist on the South Caucasus. This is a comment from Lawrence Broers in a 2021 interview. It cannot be ruled out that the dynamics of the war were predetermined. Not for Azerbaijan's victory as a goal, but to reset Armenian-Russian relations. Wonderful. Wonderful. A number of diplomats from leading countries around the world say the same phrase directly in private conversations. Armenia's defeat was part of an agreement between Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, where Armenia ended up as a pawn. Let's move on. Thomas de Waal is a senior analyst at Carnegie Europe and the author of the book Black Garden. Thomas de Waal does not speak directly about a managed defeat. He describes the process as an analyst as something managed from the outside, with Russia playing the decisive role, waiting until Armenia lost all its leverage. And today, we can see that this is exactly how things are, dear friends. And now let's move directly to the analysis. So what happened? What is a controlled defeat? What happened in 2020 cannot be called a war. We are talking about a controlled defeat. But before we discuss this, I would like to say the following. I am now addressing only Armenians around the world. The Armenian army, those who fought. They fought heroically, displaying outstanding valor during the 44-day war of 2020. The Armenians of Artsakh, those who fought, demonstrated remarkable heroism and gave their lives. The soldiers and officers are not to blame. Never blame the soldiers and officers of Artsakh and Armenia. They are heroes. And now, let's move on to the controlled defeat of 2020. How did Russia, other countries, and segments of the Armenian elite bring Armenia to capitulation? Right now, I am presenting exclusively the opinions from discussions among current military experts about the situation. I am not commenting myself. And dear friends, I have already commented on such discussions in the very first days of the war. And I have been having such discussions for all these 5 years and analyzing what happened. There are no secrets, neither for me nor for military experts, the general staffs of Western countries, nor for the leading intelligence communities. Everything is absolutely clear. And I am going to talk about this clarity now. The events of the Second Karabakh War, which should more accurately be called the controlled defeat of Armenia and Artsakh in 2020, and its continuation in 2023, revealed not only external pressure, but what did they show? How does the West see this? They revealed the internal unpreparedness of the Armenian political and military elite and system for resistance. And of course, this unpreparedness was artificially created. Ask yourself, who created it? It was created by Russia. At first glance, dear friends, Armenia appeared to be the victim of the superior forces of Azerbaijan, supported by Turkey. This was done to pull the wool over your eyes. Yes, Azerbaijan did have enormous forces. Azerbaijan was preparing, and Turkey provided unprecedented support. But the goal was to create the impression, both for you and for the world, especially for Armenians, that Armenia became the victim of Azerbaijan's superior forces. In reality, this is absolutely not the case. A thorough analysis shows the following. The defeat was orchestrated and controlled with Russia playing a key role. And also, as military analysts note, the passive and destructive actions within Armenia itself played a role. So, what was Russia's strategy? Russia was an ally, the architect of the capitulation. Russia being the formal guarantor of Armenia's security within the CSTO. And a strategic ally. It's funny, isn't it, to talk about Russia as a strategic ally. From the very beginning of the conflict, now from Azerbaijan's attack, took a position of deliberate non-intervention, both for the sake of peace and for the Armenians. Despite attacks on Armenian territory, Moscow, of course, did not activate any of its treaty obligations. So what did Moscow do? Arms deliveries to Armenia were immediately suspended. Even those deliveries, that Armenia had paid for, were not fulfilled. In other words, the Armenian government paid for the shipments, but did not receive the weapons. The Russian border guards and the base in Gyumri did not provide any support. Turkey, though, dear friends, indeed freely used the airspace of CSTO member countries. No problems at all. What did she use it for? To transfer militants from Syria. And this effectively became an endorsement of the intervention from the Kremlin. After the military defeat that Russia orchestrated for Armenia, it then presented itself as the sole guarantor of peace by deploying its contingent to Artsakh, and thus, for a time, gained leverage over both sides of the conflict. What did this give Russia? It temporarily strengthened its control over the South Caucasus, excluded Western mediation, and imposed political dependence on Yerevan under the guise of salvation. And most importantly, it secured the loyalty of Turkey and Azerbaijan, who did not let it down before the invasion of Ukraine. Someday, all the documents will be published, showing just how much these countries did for Russia in this war. So, let's move on. What do military experts, intelligence officers, and diplomats note regarding Armenia? No one can understand. Given Russia's external passivity, why were a number of actions taken and not taken in Armenia and Artsakh that seem not just mistaken, but as if coordinated with a plan for capitulation? And to this day, no one really knows, let's say, who was behind this. Look at what Western military experts are noting. Mobilization on the proper scale was not carried out, either in Armenia or in Artsakh. That is, in the most critical war, threatening the very existence of Artsakh and Armenia, mobilization was not conducted. Despite the presence of hundreds of thousands of reservists, the front was held by a limited contingent. Even in Artsakh, mobilization was not carried out, dear friends. What do the experts note? Reserves were not sent to the front. A portion of the able-bodied population, including men liable for military service, was allowed to leave Artsakh for Armenia or abroad. When Artsakh is facing the threat of destruction, men subject to military service from Artsakh are allowed to leave for Armenia and beyond the borders of Armenia and Artsakh. You know, over the past 5 years, not 40, not 50, I have heard hundreds of opinions from all over the world in personal conversations regarding accusations from many Armenians that the West did not help. Do you know what they say to that? Western assistance, diplomatic, logistical and military, was deliberately rejected. Despite offers from France, the United States, and the Armenian diaspora, Armenia chose not to allow the intervention of third parties. They also mentioned certain obligations to Russia. This is the opinion of the accused West. Many military depots, as noted by Western analysts, remained untouched. Military equipment was not fully utilized, and many units did not receive orders to move. You must understand that this set of actions has generated a stable version in the expert community. The Armenian capitulation had been prearranged with Moscow, and the military actions were seen solely as a way to clear the region of disputed territories and populations. And that's exactly how it turned out. So what are the consequences? What is the new reality, dear friends? The result was a geopolitical and moral collapse. Artsakh was legally and practically dissolved in 2023. Armenia lost the remnants of its strategic autonomy. Russia strengthened its control over the borders and internal politics of Yerevan. Today, it is absolutely clear to everyone except a certain segment of Armenians This was not a defeat in war. The Armenian people and nation did not lose to anyone. The Armenian army, its officers and soldiers, fought heroically. This was a defeat in the strategy of survival, where the ally was maneuvering. Armenia and its leadership are moving in sync toward one thing: a managed capitulation for the sake of the region's geopolitical reformatting, which has already taken place. But many Armenians don't understand this. Do you know what American and French military diplomats told me? They said they couldn't immediately recognize that what was happening in Armenia and Artsakh was a controlled capitulation. You know, for several reasons. An illusion of sovereign resistance was created. This in no way diminishes the Armenian army and the army of Artsakh, those who fought heroically. But on a global scale, through social technologies and informational noise, an illusion of Armenia's sovereign resistance was created in the world, right? That is, outwardly, let's recall, Armenia was demonstrating total readiness to fight. The official statements, mobilization on paper, diplomatic activity. And what was the perception in America and France? What was their view? This created the appearance of independent defense, rather than a pre-planned surrender, according to a plan, and under pressure from Russia. Also in the West, which speaks upon us strategic naivety, there was trust in Russia as a mediator. And who helped create this trust, if not the Armenians themselves? Who shaped the image of Russia as Armenia's ally, if not the Armenians? For a long time, the West viewed Russia as the guarantor of the status quo in the Caucasus and continued to work with it during this period within the framework of the Minsk Group. Can you imagine? Even after the war began. In fact, someone from Armenia disoriented the diaspora and the West. Can you imagine? Neither Yerevan nor Stepanakert deliberately requested direct military assistance. They rejected all offers, and all their statements were vague and belated. The West really didn't expect it. I'll tell you, no one expected it. I expected it. I said everything I could just so as not to harm Armenia, whatever was possible. But at that time, the West did not expect such a large-scale collusion. Neither the US nor France imagined that Russia's ally, Armenia, would be effectively paralyzed and would not put up resistance even though it had the resources. Do you understand what happened? The information blackout was exceptionally powerful. Russia controlled most of the information channels in the region, including Armenian media and command structures. The West was receiving a completely distorted picture, in which everything looked like a tragic but real defeat, rather than a pre-planned weakening of Armenia. But this was a pre-planned weakening of Armenia, dear friends. This is a very crucial and tragic question for all Armenians around the world, and there is still no clear answer to it. This is precisely one of the most painful secrets of the Second Karabakh War, the betrayal behind the scenes. How did the Armenian army, the heroic Armenian army, Anarins of Armenia, and the heroic Armenian army of Artsakh fight under conditions of information leaks and sabotage? In 2020, the Armenian army in Artsakh was bravely fighting not only against an enemy that was vastly superior in both numbers and advanced technology, but the Armenian army, the true heroes, worthy of Avarer, these great and courageous heroes. These young boys, conscripts and warriors of Armenia and Artsakh, they fought quite literally in the dark, without reserves, without supplies, without any air cover, surrounded by betrayal and a total devastating leak of information. So never blame the Armenian army. Neither the army of Artsakh nor the army of Armenia. They are heroes. Heroes who, having lost everything, in this kind of war, a treacherous war, orchestrated by Russia, no more than 6,000 were lost, according to the highest estimates. At the same time, Azerbaijan, together with mercenaries, Turkish and Pakistani and other officers and soldiers, lost more than 20,000. They are heroes. We must remember them and be proud that Armenian soil has produced such heroes. So in 2020, the Armenian army fought not just against a truly massive army that outnumbered and outmatched it technologically. In the darkness, let me repeat, in the darkness, reach without reserves, without sufficient supplies, without air cover. Betrayal was everywhere, and information leaks were all around. Virtually all movements of Armenian units were tracked and instantly relayed to Azerbaijan through so-called Russian allies and agents, who had been integrated into the communications and command system. And despite all this, the great Armenian army held out heroically. Small groups of fighters dealt devastating blows to the enemy. They disrupted offensives, destroyed Azerbaijani battalions, often while being semi-encircled and cut off from logistics. This was a war of great Armenian warriors, devoted but doomed. And the courage of Armenian soldiers and officers directly clashed with the disorganization of command and internal sabotage. So what happened in Shusha? What do people say, including Europeans who were there? Because there were Europeans there as well. Is this a symbol of surrender or a symbol of the Azerbaijani miracle? The story of how Turkish special forces infiltrated Shusha and captured the key Armenian fortress without decisive resistance remains inexplicable, both to me and to military analysts. According to available information, the special forces made their way along a difficult mountain route, without vehicles, and with a minimal number of soldiers. The movement of the Turkish special forces and the small Azerbaijani unit, my dear friends, across open terrain and through forests, lasted for hours. No one can explain why not a single Armenian ambush was organized. Not a single sniper stopped the column. There was no attempt to encircle or intercept them on the approaches. Perhaps all of this did happen, but neither I nor Western military experts are aware of it. But the result is clear. They made it through. That's it. Even in Shusha itself, the Turks moved almost unimpeded, in situations where even 20 armed fighters could have stopped or destroyed them. At the same time, the capital, Stepanakert, was filled with all kinds of special forces. Can this be explained by military mistakes? It cannot be explained by military mistakes. This can only be explained by sabotage, an internal prohibition against resistance, or a direct order from above not to interfere with their advance. And the people who can answer these questions are now in Baku, in prison. Maybe that's why they are in prison in Baku. So what conclusion can we draw? The heroic Armenian army and the heroic Artsakh Defense Army fought against all odds. Their soldiers fought against a superior enemy, without air support, without reserves under drone fire. But the most terrifying thing, as it was in the First War, is that they fought with an enemy behind their backs, in the form of their own system, riddled with infiltration, betrayal, and fear of Moscow. Shusha is not a defeat of the army. Never think that way. It is a political capitulation, presented as a military episode. That is what happened in Shushi. So that you understand. You should also know that, of course, Turkey was the core of the operation. The entire offensive campaign was directed by Turkish generals. Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones were used, which ensured air superiority and the destruction of Armenian equipment. Communications, intelligence, and satellite coordination were carried out using Turkish infrastructure. Turkish Army Special Forces and officers were directly involved in operations including the assault on Shusha. Pakistan provided military, technical, and intelligence support. Despite the absence of diplomatic relations with Armenia, Pakistan does not recognize Armenia's right to exist. Western observers noted the presence of Pakistani instructors and snipers. There were numerous reports, both open and classified, about the transfer of volunteers and military specialists from Pakistan to Azerbaijan. Of course, Israel played a key role in the technological aspect of the war. At the same time, I would like to mention that before I touch on Israel's role, Israel offered Armenia technology. Israel offered to build weapons manufacturing plants. Armenia refused. Keep this fact in mind. Accordingly, Israel supplied Azerbaijan with modern strike drones without LoRa systems. For example, the Harop drone and the most advanced electronic warfare systems. Israeli military specialists trained and instructed Azerbaijani operators. There is information that Israeli intelligence data was also passed on to Baku. And now about the mercenaries and jihadists. From Turkish territory, under the auspices of MIT, the Turkish Intelligence Service, up to 3,000 Syrian and Libyan militants were transferred to Azerbaijan. These groups were directly involved. All of this has been documented. Not by the Armenian side of Basanis, as assault units on the front lines, as well as for psychological pressure and terror against Armenian positions and civilian targets. The presence of these groups, in addition to intelligence data, has been confirmed by international human rights organizations. And dear friends, it was the French intelligence service that openly revealed this. Therefore, Azerbaijan's victory was in fact achieved. But this is not a victory of the Azerbaijani army. Azerbaijan did not win on its own. Artsakh fought against an entire multinational, well-armed, and coordinated system, where every element from Turkish generals to Pakistani snipers and Syrian militants had its own role. This was a war against a small republic, left alone, and under the treacherous control of the so-called ally, Great Russia. So, the brief and honest answer. Unfortunately, we continue. The Artsakh army did not fight at full strength, despite many operational areas of heroic resistance. No one can explain why there was no full mobilization and resistance. No one can explain this, and I don't know. There was no general mobilization in Artsakh. Reservists and able-bodied men were not called up en masse. Moreover, many were allowed to leave Artsakh during the war. People who should be giving testimony, I just don't know to whom and where, are now in Baku, in prison. Absolutely. You know, my colleagues from America, from France, and from the United Kingdom, which is often accused of not liking Armenia, told me about this. Do you know what they said to me? Why was part of the equipment and the warehouses of the Artsakh Defense Army not used? And I don't know why. Or rather, you understand that I know a lot, and not just me. Why was the equipment kept in reserve or under the control of structures that were dependent on Russia? Certain sections of the front. And this is the perspective of Western military experts, were simply surrendered without a fight or after only minimal formal resistance. This was especially true in the southern direction and on the roads to Shushi. The command often did not give the order to counterattack, and in some cases she gave direct orders to retreat. This was despite having combat-ready units in the area. How do you feel about that difference? Intelligence and coordination were paralyzed. The army did not have access to satellite data and did not receive information in real time, unlike the enemy. That is the reality. And it is very important for Armenians to reflect on this. Of course, there were exceptions. Many units, especially volunteers and veterans, heroic volunteers and veterans, fought with utmost determination. Despite the lack of logistics and support, the battles for Karintak, for Hadrut, for Martuni, and for part of Shushi demonstrated incredible feats of heroism. The deaths of numerous commanders, dozens of them, great commanders from lieutenant to colonel, such as Armen Akfanyan and other fighters, became a symbol that at the level of soldiers and officers, the army fought honorably. So what conclusion do military experts draw? I'm not even talking about Armenia. Right now, we are not considering Armenia or the Armenian army. The Artsakh army could have put up a much more serious resistance if it had been fully mobilized, received orders to hold positions and counterattack, and had not acted under the pressure of Russian overseers and disorganized command. This was an army with tremendous military potential, but the Artsakh army was forced to lose. That's the point. Tens of thousands of Armenians from all over the world wanted to come to defend the homeland. They would have crushed Azerbaijan, even with all the support from Turkey, Pakistan, and Russia's plans. But they didn't make it to either Artsakh or Armenia. Even Armenian citizens who wanted to fight couldn't get to Armenia or Artsakh. How did it happen that reservists and Armenians, officers, volunteers from the diaspora were systematically disorganized? Why didn't they get involved? And why weren't they really allowed to join the defense of Artsakh? Volunteers without a war, right? How was Armenia not allowed to fight? Never blame the Armenian people. Don't you dare blame the Armenian army. Look at the facts. During the Second Karabakh War, thousands of Armenians around the world, from Lebanon and France to the USA and Russia, Greece, distant Armenian diasporas, Argentina and Uruguay, were ready to immediately come to Armenia and take part in the defense of Artsakh. However, the structures that were supposed to implement this deliberately blocked, delayed, and disorganized this flow. What was happening inside Armenia? Disorientation and marginalization of reservists. Yes, all of this is so that you understand just how powerful Russia is, that it was able to bring Armenia to such a situation. Russia is indeed a powerful country. There was a complete international blockade. Visas and entry permits were not issued for volunteers from the diaspora. Many were deliberately turned back at airports. A huge amount of information came from Greece and other countries, with requests not to let Armenians leave from there. Interesting, isn't it? Many people were sent back from airports or waited for weeks for permission that never came. Flying groups of volunteers from Lebanon, Syria, France, and the USA either did not receive routes and weapons upon arrival, those who managed to break through, or were sent to the rear to wait, where their participation was rendered meaningless. Numerous Armenians with combat experience from Lebanon and Syria, can you imagine, were not deployed as intended. Under the pretext of disorganization, they were sent back. Reservists in Armenia itself did not receive orders. The assembly points were in chaos. The lists did not match reality. Many waited for weeks for a call-up that never came. People who volunteered were sent home under various pretexts. Lack of transportation, lack of uniforms. Everything is already staffed. There are enough soldiers and officers. The military enlistment offices were simply paralyzed, sometimes deliberately. And veterans from the 90s could not manage to get sent to the front. In a number of cases, rotations between Armenia and Artsakh simply did not take place. Even when transportation was available, people remained in the barracks. A number of commanders claimed that the involvement of volunteers interfered with coordination, although in reality, this was an order from the political center. Which center, we do not know, to minimize the number of fighters. I could tell a lot and in great detail. I don't see any point in that. I see the point in strengthening Armenia as much as possible and helping her, because you can see the situation Armenia is in. What special operations are being carried out against Armenia, from both outside and within. And from everything that has happened. First of all, it needs to be known. It is necessary to draw conclusions. If conclusions are not drawn, there will be no Armenia. Think about what I have told you today. A managed war, a managed defeat, a war that Armenia could have won, and Artsakh has turned into the current status quo. I have told you what, unfortunately, dozens and hundreds of experts and analysts should have been saying. Think, analyze, be aware. Subscribe to my channel. Give it a like. I am always with you. And I can promise you that I am doing everything I can to help Armenia. I do not communicate with either the authorities or the opposition in any way. I am not interested in that. It is pointless. I will support Armenia to the fullest, no matter who is in power. That is my principle and my credo. Once again, thank you very much. And until we meet again.